Hey, good afternoon, everyone. Hang tight with us just a couple more minutes. We're going to start here at 1:01 while we let some more people get on. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for OCAP Session 9. This is our final session of the what I'll call the 2022 spring and summer, and we'll be taking a couple months before we hit it back again in the fall. We've had a really good string of sessions, and I'm happy to be kind of finalizing this one with a really great session coming up as well. If you are taking the exam, I know a couple of you here in this room are taking that next Thursday at 1 o'clock. That'll be administered virtually. A link was sent out to all those interested to sign up, and you should have received a Dropbox link and study material for those that did sign up. If you're unsure and you're still interested or just have some questions, feel free to reach out to me after this session, and we'll cover that as well. This session will be recorded, so this will be available for those that are maybe unable to reach us today live here at 1 o'clock. Today, we have a session on a topic that is very important to many airports, really to all airports in our state, whether you're commercial or general aviation, and one that can sometimes be a little bit difficult to tackle. Our minimum standards session today will be presented by Paul Priegel, Stillwater Regional Airport Director. Paul has served, of course, as the OAOA Regional Director and through executive committee positions, most recently as president here in 2021 and 2022. He's also an active educator, starting his 12th year as an adjunct professor at Oklahoma State University, where he teaches aviation security and management courses for the School of Aviation. Paul currently serves on the U.S. Contract Tower Policy Board and many other committees within the South Central chapter and national level of AAAE. Paul, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Foster. Good afternoon, everyone. I apologize, for some reason cannot get my video at my desk to work, which is fine. You don't want to see my ugly face anyways, but the most important part is the presentation. So I hope everyone can see the presentation. I would also encourage you to, if you have questions come up throughout, by all means, I'm not seeing the chat, but I think one of us between Foster and I will be able to see the chat. And so we will have opportunities at the end for question and answers. I will tell you, I'm by no means an expert in this. I kind of by default, we just went through this process at our airport. And so just while the information was fresh on my mind and there was a need, decided we would put this together for everyone, because it is one of those things that you don't do a lot as far as updating your minimum standards, but when they need updated, they usually need updated, and it's quite a task. So we'll get started here. There we go. So, excuse me, the first thing kind of talk about is what are minimum standards. Minimum standards are just that. They are a minimum. Basically, if you think about it, they're setting the bar for what you want at your airport. The FAA highly recommends implementing and using minimum standards as a way to minimize potential violations of federal obligations at obligated airports. So if you have received federal grants, you are an obligated airport. We have 39 grant assurances that we are required to adhere to. And although not every one of them tie back into minimum standards, if you look over those grant assurances, you will see spatterings throughout of things that really should be incorporated into your minimum standards that will help you stay in compliance with those. Specifically, two things that it really wants to focus on is airports and facilities must be available for public use as an airport. And then terms imposed must be reasonably reasonable and applied without unjust discrimination. And we're going to talk a lot more about that as we go ahead. And again, these stem from grant assurances, or if you are in some of the old antiquated agreements, the early war agreements and stuff, some of the property conveyance obligations that may come with that. So are they or aren't they? So minimum standards are optional. Believe it or not, you are not required to have minimum standards at your airport, even though the FAA highly recommends them. There's nobody that's going to come into your door and say, you don't have minimum standards, you're going to be shut down or something like that. The FAA only provides guidance on developing the standards. So they're there to support you. There is an advisory circular, which I'll talk about here in a little bit. But for the most part, the FAA it's nothing they approve. They're there to help you. Usually it's at the regional district level, but they will provide that guidance, but they're not, there's not any set, formats that you're going to have, like emergency plans and stuff, where they'll actually give you a template and say, we want you to follow that. That's not really what they do with this. It's not intended to address non-aeronautical entities. So, you don't put things like your restaurants, your concessionaires, your rental cars in there. It's not to say you cannot have, as an airport, a set of minimum standards for those entities. It's just not what we're going to be talking about today. These are actually for aeronautical activities. They are not rules and regulations. A lot of people confuse the two. They say, well, minimum standards also talk about, security procedures and how fast you can drive on the apron and what you can store in your hangars and stuff like that. That is not something that's usually addressed in minimum standards. Those are addressed in rules and regulations. Sometimes they're addressed in leases, but they're not usually something in minimum standards. So why do we do this? Why would we put ourselves through this? It's not required. Why would we do anything else we're not required to do? Well, again, as a federally obligated airport, you agree to make available the opportunity to engage in commercial aeronautical activities by persons, firms, or corporations that meet reasonable minimum standards established by the airport sponsor. And that's directly out of advisory circular. Of course, it references minimum standards there. But as that, you're ensuring a safe, efficient, adequate level of operation and service offering to your public, to your users. And that's very important. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that as well. But thinking about your pilots coming in, they're going to pull up to a mechanic shop on your airport. They need to be assured that that mechanic shop has a certain minimum standard that they're adhering to be in operation there. Whether it's a certain number of certification or licensing, whether it's facilities adequate enough to service their aircraft, protect their aircraft, whatever that case may be, they need to have that assurance that is expected and adhered to at an airport. Once implemented, minimum standards should be applied uniformly and objectively to all similarly situated on-airport aeronautic service providers. And we're going to talk a little bit about this later when we talk about development of minimum standards, because there's some misconceptions out there of, well, I've got this FBO, I'm not really happy with them, but I can't really do anything because they're grandfathered in, or they're just, I don't really like what they're doing or not doing, but I can't really change it because that's what they signed up for. Well, that's not the case. You can raise that bar anytime you want, as long as you are applying it uniformly, and of course it's reasonable. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So what are the objectives of minimum standards? They're to protect the users from unlicensed and unauthorized products and services, which is always a good thing. Maintain and enhance the availability of adequate service for all airport users. And this really is something that you want to keep in mind for your fixed-based operators. Everyone that owns an FBO or that runs an FBO knows that the cream of the crop of the FBO world is your fuel cells. And it's very easy to say, yeah, I'm just going to come in and do fuel cells, and I'm going to offer a little, I'm going to park airplanes and do this and that, but I'm not going to do a full service FBO. Well, you're selling yourself short as an airport, and you're really underserving your community of pilots and users that come into your airport. So making sure that you have the requirements of those FBOs or whatever to come in and offer adequate services that are needed to the users of your airport. It also helps promote the orderly development of airport land, ensures efficiency of operations, and of course promotes safety in all airport activities. So what gives you the authority as an airport operator to establish minimum standards? Well, plain and simple, it's your grant assurances, but specifically grant assurance 22, which is economic non-discrimination. And it specifically says that the sponsor may establish such reasonable and not unjustly discriminatory conditions to be met by all users of the airport as may be necessary for the safe and efficient operation of the airport, plain and simple. The sponsor may prohibit or limit any given type, kind, or class of aeronautical use of the airport if such action is necessary for the safe operation of the airport or necessary to serve the civil aviation needs of the public. And we're going to talk specifically about this here in a little bit, because you need to make sure before you deem something unsafe that you really know what that means, because there have been some cases we're going to talk about where in the name of safety, something has been denied and it really was not something that was justified. And the FAA came back and actually ruled against that airport for doing that. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So when we're developing minimum standards, the most critical consideration is really knowing your airport, knowing what the environment is, what operations you have, what your needs are. Although you can obtain, and I would, having just gone through this process, I would highly recommend that the easiest thing is to go to the internet, go to Google, just type in airport minimum standards, and you will just start finding web page after web page, usually airport pages that are just listing their PDF version of their minimum standards on their web page. And I would peruse through them, and if I thought I liked them, I would download them, keep them in a file as kind of some reference material. But I also, you cannot just copy and paste minimum standards just because every airport is different. We all know the saying, if you've seen one airport, you've seen one airport. It is really no more true in the minimum standards world. The last thing you want to do is go through the trouble of updating your minimum standards and getting everything in line the way you want it, and then them not being adequate. Or on the other side of it, they could overimpose certain standards that are not reasonable for your operations or entities or whatever you have on your airfield, and then it could be detrimental for them as well. So there is a balance, but I will say I was able to look at a lot of different minimum standards, and what I did take from another airport was a format. There was a lot of different formats. Some of them are just run on paragraph, really no sections, anything. Some of them are a little bit more divided out, and I really wanted ours to be concise and simple, but also allow us to stay well organized, be able to take out a section. If someone just was coming in for a certain, like an FBO, we could take that FBO section and give to them. If somebody just needed the application, we could give them that application. If someone needed the insurance requirements, there's a one-page or appendix. Here you go. Here's your insurance requirements. And so that was how we chose to do it. By all means, you don't have to do it that way. So just find something that works best for you, that makes sense to you. Think about how you might use it, because this is not a document that, although it can gather dust because it's not updated a lot, it is something you should be using, and you should be making sure is well known when you have new and existing service providers on your airport. Although minimum standards can be modified, they do discourage changing them constantly. Sometimes we like to get into documents, particularly like if you're a 139 airport, where your security plans and your emergency plans and all that, they just seem to always change. The ink hardly dries before you're changing it again. It's not to say you can't change, but understand this is a bar that you're setting for your service providers, and you want them to adhere to it. But a lot of this stuff that you're asking them to do is going to be built into their business model. It's going to be built into their budgets. It's going to be built into should be the cloth of fabric that makes up their whole business, should really be have your minimum standards built into it. So if you continually change things and expectations, you end up having frustrations. You could have, they're not able to meet the demands. They could just say, you know what, we can't adhere to this, or whatever the case may be. So it's a good idea to review them and to make sure that you are kind of staying ahead of things. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more, like in fuel cells, for example. If you know, we've got a lot of different things ahead for maybe some alternate fuels for our aircraft. You don't necessarily need to put those in right now, but those are things that you need to kind of keep on the front of your mind if these areas might need to change later. With that, if you do have things that might change on a regular basis, you can do those via an appendices or something of that nature that you can just pull out and say, okay, this updates every year, this updates every 2 years, or whatever the case may be. Most of the time, things in minimum standards should be pretty solid. And so when you are writing these minimum standards, try to use language that is specific enough to serve the purpose, but is not so confining that you're going to have to change it for every little situation that comes up. And then, of course, developing a process that not only allows staff to be able to review a bunch of different formats and things, but also getting as much exposure during the development process is always helpful to get that feedback. Even if they don't provide the feedback or anything, at least they can be content to know that they did see it, they had their opportunity. We went through that. We used our airport advisory board. After we got a draft version, we let them study it, offer comments. We changed, based on theirs. We had another meeting, and some of the comments that they wanted, we weren't able to adhere to. So we had to have a meeting to explain why, this wasn't something we wanted to put in our minimum standards, and kind of went back and forth a little bit. Then we had an open public comment series where we put it on the website. We sent it to our existing users, and then put it out on our webpage and city sites, and made sure people had the opportunities for feedback. And then we took it to one last reading by the advisory board, and then of course it was ultimately adopted by our city council via resolution. Every airport's going to do things a little differently. If you don't have an advisory board, or if your commission or council doesn't really care to be involved in it, it may just be something as an airport manager, you can put the stamp on it and call it good. But that was the process we used at our level. So when you're developing, some of the factors to consider is, it's pretty simple. What type of airport are you? And then what type of activities do you have? Again, if you get into some copy and pasting, what you may see is, for example, one of the early minimum standards I looked at, I really liked some of the content of it, but there's some things that didn't apply to us. Like they had a lot of ag operations, for example. So they were having the need for space and environmental concerns that involved the ag pilots, as far as the chemicals that they sprayed, and the storage and the clean outs and all that stuff. Not to say we wouldn't have an ag company that maybe approach us. I want to be able to know where to get that information, but right now we just don't really have that demand in the specific area we are. You go 50, 60 miles west of us, that's a pretty regular thing for some of the airports out in Western Oklahoma. So just knowing what type of activity you have is really going to help you develop those minimum standards. With that, you got to look at the space requirements for those activities. Looking at your application process is very important. And again, this comes down to the individual airport's comfortableness and the policy and procedure that either you as an airport management, or maybe if you have an oversighting thing like a trust or an authority, or even your city or county, making sure that you get the requirements that you need to make your decision, and to make a good assessment of the viability of that business, but also that it's not too overtaxing on the applicant. And so there's a balance there. And this is also a problem if you get into copy and pasting, because you get into some airports and they want everything down to your pant size and blood type. And then you get in some airports and it's a one-page application that doesn't hardly cover anything. So making sure you customize that application process, as well as, I'll go ahead and touch on the insurance requirements. Not that there's a whole lot of variance, because most of the airports in Oklahoma cover the tort claim, are kind of aligned with that. But making sure that you talk to whoever your underwriters are. We actually, our city is self-insured. However, because of the magnitude of facilities we have at our structure, we actually have a liability policy and some property policies for the airport. So when we were developing this, we actually sent this task over to our underwriters, and for free, they just sent us a list of things that, we sent kind of the basic framework, and they said, how much would we be required or need to require to adequately cover our interest as an airport in these different entities? And they listed them all out, and we let our legal review it. We let our city finance review it, city management. Everybody was in concurrence, and that became a part of our minimum standards, so that we can say this is our minimum insurance requirements. Looking at the activities, not only what's going to happen with the front office stuff, but also the behind the scenes things. Are there things like if we're dealing with an ag pilot, or we're dealing with a paint shop or something of that nature? What are things that are going to have to be required of them, set forth in practices, in ways they operate, ways, the space they need to adhere to any sanitation, health, or safety codes that you may have as an airport or as a community? Again, thinking about minimum standards in the way of, I'm going to start a business, or I'm going to take my business to this airport. It's a lot more than just my day-to-day, what rules do I have to follow? This should really, again, be in the fabric of what they do in the design. When they're designing their facilities, or they're evaluating at a facility that you have, is it big enough based on how I know I operate and what other expectations you have? Because the last thing you want to do is someone to make a decision, particularly if they're having to build a structure to perform a service, and then all of a sudden you have a city inspector, or you have a state level or federal level person come in and say, hey, you've got to do this, this, and this, and it was nothing that was ever conveyed to them as an airport. It wasn't built into these standards, and now all of a sudden they don't have enough space, or maybe drainage isn't right, or maybe they're operating totally different than what they need to be. That can be very disruptive to these entities. So making sure you get that flushed out ahead of time is very important. And then making sure that the standard is relevant to the activity which is to be applied. Not every aeronautical service provider needs to have a lobby with air conditioning and heat and male and female bathrooms and parking and all this. It just kind of depends on what you have on the property. Not every entity is going to have to maintain public hours 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. Again, knowing what you have on your airport, what your needs are, and developing those. This is probably one of the most, I'm not going to say it was eye-opening as much as it was just kind of a relief to see this, because I think all of us, particularly if we're coming into an airport that has already have established businesses, or we are in a very, like most of us as airport managers, directors, are kind of in a high political climate on most things. It's sometimes difficult to come in and rock the boat a little bit, right? And so it's one of these things that looking at this, you think, well, again, my earlier example, I have an FBO that I really, they do okay, but you compare our FBO to some other FBOs, they're just not doing the services that others are doing, and we're losing business, or they're not coming in and doing things, they're not just providing the services that we need as an airport. And as a result of that, let's say, for example, aircraft towing, for example, or aircraft removal. You have something happen on your runway, pop tire or whatever, and now all of a sudden you got an aircraft to middle of your runway, and your runway's shut down, and your FBO is not able to remove that. Well, who incurs the cost of that? The city does, or the airport, right? It's not unreasonable, and it is a typical expectation that an FBO, as a full service FBO, has the ability for aircraft removal, or at the very least can contract that out. Well, if you don't have those expectations in place, and let's say you want to add that, let's say that's never been an issue, and all of a sudden, bam, you've got 3 of them in a month, and all of a sudden you're, as an airport, just not able to take on this task, and that's something that really needs to happen at the FBO level. There's nothing that prevents you from adding that into your minimum standards. The key is whatever you do for one, you have to do for all. So if you've got 2 FBOs, you can't say, well, FBO 1, you've got to provide our aircraft removal service. FBO 2, you don't have to worry about it. You've got to apply it uniformly. So you got to just keep up with that. Minimum standards should be updated to reflect current conditions and not in the past, so that's very important. Looking at what aeronautical business ventures you desire to attract to the airport is also important. Being able to look ahead and see the opportunities there, I think all of us as airport managers try to do, and making sure that our minimum standards provide an opportunity for those things to come and rest at your airport. The last thing you want is somebody to come in on a new venture that could revolutionize your use of your airport or add economic impact or whatever the case may be. And then all of a sudden they get tangled in a cobweb of mess of minimum standards because one, you didn't see it coming and it's not an open door for them. There's too much red tape for them to get through, or you haven't addressed it at all and you don't really have the mechanism to put in place in a timely manner to get them situated. So having that foresight, and this is a great example of when you might on an annual basis really start looking at your minimum standards and looking at what's ahead. If that happens here, are we able to accommodate? New minimum standards, again, can be developed to better fit a business as long as it's not applying unreasonable standards or creating a situation that will unjustly discriminate against other similarly situated service providers. So that's the rule. You can put that bar wherever you want it, as long as it's not unreasonable, as long as it's uniformly applied. When we talk about specialized aviation service operations or SASOs, these are also sometimes called single service providers or special FBOs. These are just single service entities, flight schools. You can see the list there: air ambulance, instruments, avionics, whatever the case may be. Again, you may not need for example, flight training. If you look in Part 141, there are specific requirements listed out on what you need to have space-wise and facility-wise to facilitate flight training. That's a lot different than someone that might have a maintenance shop or someone that's going to do aircraft sales. Some examples, like in aircraft sales, you may require them to have product on hand, or maybe not aircraft sales, but maybe some, something that's selling avionics or something. You may require them to have a certain amount of products on hand or availability of. You may require that if you're going to have an aircraft maintenance place, that they have to have a lobby, a customer service lobby. And this could involve, for example, security stuff. If you're a 139 airport or you have a security program that you don't want public coming in off the street and walking directly out into a hangar where they could then walk out onto a badged area or something like that, you can put requirements in there that you are to have a secure lobby that receives public walk-ins, but also maintains them in a unsecure area of the airport. You could require them to have bathroom facilities. You could require certain hours of operation and all of that. If you do have independent operators, and this would be just somebody, for example, let's say you have I'm not going to say fly-by-night business, but just a pop-up business says, hey, we want to start, doing a mobile aircraft cleaning service. We just want to come in as needed. We're not setting up on your airport. We're just going to, someone's going to call us and we just would need access to the aircraft or the hangar. We're going to go in, we're going to do a cleaning, external and internal cleaning. You still need to have your standards in place, but you probably are going to have a different structure for them. And more than likely, you're going to have some sort of a cost share or something where they're going to remit some sort of a fee or portion of their profits to the airport for providing services on the airport. But you're still going to have some regulations in there. For example, particularly if it's an airplane wash facility or service provider, you're going to want to make sure that they know exactly where they can and can't wash aircraft in correspondence with your stormwater pollution plan or things of that nature. So you can put those in your minimum standards, but there's also some room in some other ways in your airport to have an internal policy that kind of allows that to still go on. Through the fence operators, these are not really liked by the FAA. In fact, there's no obligation whatsoever for an airport to authorize these. And for those that aren't familiar with these, an example might be you're next to your airport. There is a residential community that develops that's a flying community, and they're going to do these hangar homes where they've got, instead of a car, they've got a taxi lane down the middle, and they've got you pull your plane into a hangar that's also your home. And they're not a part of the airport property, but obviously they need access to the airport to fly. That would be an example. You got to really make sure that your minimum standards, if it allows for that, they're not undermined by these through the fence agreements. And so there is a requirement to work with the FAA regional division if you are going to get into a through the fence agreement, to let them look at everything, including your minimum standards, including your agreements, your airport layout plans, all of that, so that you're not getting yourself in trouble. Okay. So there's not again, these aren't very popular. They're not liked at all, but there is occasions, particularly on airports that are out of space, and you may find yourself bumped up next to some farmland. And next thing you know, Farmer John dies and kids sell the land to the highest bidder. And next thing you know, you got a cargo facility next to you that's not on your airport, but they need access to the airport to run their business. And so you might get into some things like that. If you do have a through the fence agreement, this is the recommendation from the FAA as far as what you need to have in there. Specific rights of access, the payment provisions, expiration date, default termination provisions, obviously insurance indemnity, I think is in everything. Clear statement of subordination to grant assurances. So making sure that, if it comes push to shove, we're always going to be following grant assurances. You're not going to have the upper hand in this just because of something on writing. And then also the prohibition of assignment or sale of the agreement. So a lot of times you'll get in, particularly if you get into businesses or even sometimes residential communities, that will change hands or ownership. And you got to make sure that that's not just passed around. Talk about self-fueling and other service activities. Self-fueling by owner or operator of their own aircraft using their own employees and equipment is not considered commercial activity. Okay, it's not considered commercial activity. And where this might come into play, let's say you have an air ambulance on your airfield, and that air ambulance is a national air ambulance, and they have a national fuel contract with XYZ fueling company. And they also have a need to fuel after hours when the FBO is closed and you don't have a self-service availability. There are times when, even if you own your fuel farm and you have an FBO that's your provider of fuel or service provider of fuel, that you can allow them to do self-fueling operations. If you're going to allow that, you're obviously going to regulate that and position that in accordance with the layout plan. You're going to make sure there's a lease agreement for that space they're using, but it also has to be their employees fueling their aircraft. So they can't sell fuel next door to somebody just because their buddy's flying next door. They can get the fuel from wherever they want, but the airport still can collect a flowage fee as it comes through the fence and goes into their tank. So keep that in mind. Airports can regulate the storage location and methods, and they do have the right to inspect, whether it's stormwater pollution inspections or just the fact, their records to make sure that they're adhering to proper fuel handling and storage protocols as governed. It's not the same as using a self-service fueling pump by the airport or FBO. So if you've got a self-service pump, that is not considered self-fueling. This is truly an outfit like a flight school or an air ambulance or a corporation that has their own fueling supply that they use their own employees to fuel their own equipment. On that, they cannot contract it out. They can't say, well, we're going to have, ABC fueling company come in 3 days a week, drive their mobile refueler onto onto the airport and come fuel up all our jets. No, you can't do that. It has to be truly a self-fueling operation. Other self-services that you might see or run into that, again, don't really fall into this would be washing, changing oil, cleaning, repairing, maintaining. There's a whole list of things in Part 143 that defines what an owner can do with their aircraft that doesn't necessarily constitute commercial aeronautic activity. On fuel cells, most airports require fuel cells to be part of a full service FBO rather than a SASO. I think that's very, very common sense. As you all know, again, if the FBO was to be perfectly transparent, you're gonna see that 85–90% of their revenue comes from fuel cells. And if you just say, well, you don't have to be an FBO, you just need to be a fuel provider, you could very, very much have your FBO and your fuel provider both run themselves out of business, because you get a fuel provider come in and all they've got to maintain is some mobile refuelers and a couple of staff, and they just go chase the tail numbers and start plugging fuel. They're going to be able to undercut the FBO because they don't have the overhead, they don't have the expenses, and then the FBO is not going to be able to compete with them. So then they're going to lose their fueling sales, which is going to drive their operations down, and it's just not good for anybody. And so most of the time, you're going to see a requirement that if you're going to sell fuel, you're going to be doing it as a full service FBO. I'm going to talk about what that looks like, I think, on the next slide. If you are going to allow fuel sales outside of your organization, you need to have some careful considerations on things like where your fuel tanks are going to be installed. If you're not in control of those yourself, if they're going to come in and add new fuel tanks and things like that, again, you just need to make sure that it aligns with your airport layout plans and environmental factors and all that good stuff. Also, what fuel capacities, types, and volumes are required to meet the needs of the airport. This can be found in your master plan. A lot of times in your forecasting will tell, they'll analyze, they'll look at your facilities and look and see what you have and what you might need. These are things that you need to keep an eye on, because things like, for example, it could be your on-field storage. So it could be the size of your storage tanks, but it also could be the mobile refuelers you have. If, for example, you have commercial service or you have regular air taxi service or whatever that's on a time schedule, and you've got one mobile refueler for Jet A, and it goes down, what's your backup? Does that just totally shut you down? You have a flight school that does 300 operations a day, and all of a sudden they've got one avgas tank and it goes down. What's your option? So making sure that they have backups in place, and or the other side of that would be if they've got a small Jet A refueler, and you get 10 helicopters, military helicopters, something at a time, and next thing you know, they're having to make 5 trips back to the fuel farm to fill those up. And now the next time the military is not going to stop because now it just takes too long to refuel there. It can be a problem. So analyzing your operations, what you need, and making sure that you've got those provisions in place. And again, you get into insurance and indemnity, specifically in fueling. That's a big thing. Wanting to make sure that they have ample coverage of the per incident for anything that might happen as a result of that fuel cell. And then what training and qualifications, how much personnel, what does that look like for their operation, to make sure that they maintain all of that. That's also very important. Fixed-based operators, typically, the list here is what you should be requiring from your fixed-based operators, either providing the service themselves or at the very least contracting that service out. So making sure that all of these are available. And again, if it's not available, at least they know who to call to have that service delivered in a timely manner. Flight training service providers, what type of flight training will they provide? Is there a minimum requirement for classroom space? What type of aircraft? Where are they going to store that aircraft? Where are they going to maintain it? Is this a full-time deal? Is this a part-time deal? Are they operating out of a T hangar? Are they operating out of some sort of a bigger facility? You need to know all of that. What other requirements are you going to require of them? Again, you get into what level of service are you wanting to provide to your users? What standard are you wanting to adhere to? Because anybody that's given any type of flight training knows you can make a lot of money if you're just driving to the airport in your personal vehicle and hopping out with your flight bag and going to work, right? You don't have the overhead, you don't have, to maintain utilities or facilities or staffing or phone calls or anything. You just, hey, call my cell phone, I'll come out and hop in your seat and give you some lessons type deal. That's really where the money's at. But when you start running an actual flight school, there's a lot of things that you have to consider. So making sure that you look at that and making sure they're adhered to and align with the federal regulations. Same thing with aircraft, engine repair, maintenance things, looking at what type of services they're going to be providing and what aligns to the requirements of that, whether it's a federal requirement, whether it's space things, making sure that, they're not, trying to operate on four different aircraft in a place that really needs to only have two. Making sure that when they take someone's aircraft on, that they're not exposing it to unjust damage or potential for damage or theft or whatever the case may be. So making sure that the facilities and stuff meet those. And then of course you want to make sure that they're adhering to proper safety standards, ventilation, drainage, all of that things that might be required. Skydiving and ultralight vehicles. This is probably one of the more controversial things that gets a lot of airports in a bind. Any restrictions, limitation, or ban on skydiving on the airport must be based on the grant assurance allowing sponsor to prohibit limit activity for safe operations of the airport. So things that you're going to consider: will activity present safety hazards? Can activity be safely accommodated at the airport? What are the reasonable fees and jumpers and organizations can pay for the use of the airport property? Again, a lot of these, they're not going to have a facility. They're going to come in, they're going to have their jump plane, they're going to have a group meet, they're going to sit out and lay their crap out in a yard, fold it out, maybe have a picnic, listen to radio. They're not going to be your typical airport users. They're going to go up, they're going to jump, come back, they may repackage and do it again, but they're just going to need a lot of space. And it's probably going to be isolated to what? Weekends, right? Most people aren't just skydiving 7 days a week. It's usually a weekend deal. It's also somewhat seasonal, depending on what part of the country you live in. So you're probably not going to see, unless you're in a real touristy area, probably not in the state of Oklahoma, although I do know there's some actual skydiving outfits. But you go to like Hawaii or something, yeah, they have a need for 7 day a week operations like that. But somewhere like Oklahoma, you're not going to see a lot of those around. But not to say you're not going to have businesses that do that. So looking at that, looking at the ATC, the air traffic control interactions, and then what impact might it have to your other activities on the airport. There are some common skydiving concerns, and I've kind of divided up into two categories. One's from the airport or sponsor, and the other is community. And these are pretty common. I know if someone were to ask me, hey, can we go do some skydiving on your airport? These are some of the things that I would be saying to myself, well, man, we got access issues, movement area, what kind of liability are we going to incur as an airport? How are they going to interact with the air traffic control tower? Or if they do it, before the tower opens, how are we going to coordinate that? And so there's just all kinds of questions that come with that. On the community side, of course, you've got noise and the fear of improper behavior, and what happens if they don't land in their landing zone and they land in my backyard, or they land on my private property, or whatever the case may be. So there's all kinds of concerns that'll come. And the reason I say this is because the first time one of them tries to pop up in your community, you're going to have these questions internally, and you're also going to have the opposers in your community that are going to your city council, your management, and all that, going, hey, we don't want this, or you're going to have to answer these. So these are just things to consider. So when we talk about safe operations, again, grant assurance number 22 says you can limit that activity if it is necessary for the safe operation of the airport. But also, there have been quite a few in the name of safety determinations made at airports that were then overturned through a Part 16 process. And for those that are not familiar, Part 13 is kind of an informal process. It's really designed to hopefully the airport and the complainant can figure it out. And then if it doesn't, And then there is a true determination, or there's thought that there is a grant assurance being violated, it will be escalated to a Part 16 complaint, which will be investigated by the FAA. I've got a couple of cases here, and I just threw these in here because out of these cases became some, what I would call, I'm not going to say landmark decisions, but at least some precedents that the FAA is probably going to refer back to if these issues come up in your community. So Longmont, Colorado, they actually were going to restrict operations because they said it wasn't safe to do operations with their airport. And they said the main complaint was also for noise, that it was a noise issue. And so they had multiple arguments. The FAA came back and said, no, you can't restrict them based on noise. That's not your job. There's, as you all know, there's environmental impact processes that you can go through that gets noise studies and things of that nature. But in the director's desk, you're not really able to make that determination. But they did say, based on your activity at your airport and the efficiency of operations, you can limit, and they made them limit it to no more than 50,000 operations in a year, which to me was just mind blowing. I'm not really sure what that looks like on a skydiving venture, but that's a lot of operations that you all know. And so, but they did say you can limit it to 50,000 or less. You just can't limit it based on noise itself. State of Hawaii got into a deal at an airport, and there's a couple of cool things. I say cool things, just the mindful things to come out of here. One of the things was they said, you know, we're still in the process of developing this. We haven't really thought about this, but we're going to develop this and some rules and regulations. We'll get back with you, you know. And they just kept delaying and delaying and delaying. And then they used the excuse of, well, we've got some federal regulations that we're still looking at. We're waiting on some counsel from different entities, and you know, there might be this state thing that comes out, and they just kind of kept kicking the can down the road. Well, one of the things the federal government said is you cannot use that. Your inability to provide them with guidance does not give you the right to deny an otherwise safe operation. So they kind of got in a bind there. In fact, they said that the airport delaying the implementing rules and regulations preventing these operations actually violated Grant Assurance 22. The other argument they had is we're a 139 airport. Oh, we can't do it. We're a 139 airport. I'm going to be honest with you. I've had some questions come up to me on some things, and I'm like, hey, we're a 139 airport. We're not going to do that here. Now, looking hindsight, I could have definitely made sure that, I mean, there was a safety concern as well, but just using the blanket, we're a 139 airport, we can't do it. It's not acceptable. Likewise, if you are a 139 airport or you're wanting to become one, just because you have a skydiving operation does not necessarily jeopardize the chances of you doing that. Obviously, you're just going to have to incorporate that into your plans and programs. And then finally, the Santa Clara County, California, this particular airport, basically we're just like, listen, this is going to up our liability. We can't accommodate you. We as a city or we as a sponsor cannot meet these requirements. You know, these are going to elevate our requirements. That is not an excuse. That's not a safety deal. That's just, you know, that's unfortunately something you're going to have to work with. And then also there was an argument that, well, we've got IFR and VFR heavy traffic patterns, and we can't have skydiving in the midst of that. And they determined that they actually did studies and said, yeah, actually they can coexist together. You just need to do it. So again, these are things that might come up at your airport, and I think we all can kind of tilt our head one way on a lot of these on a gut reaction and go, boy, that doesn't sound safe. But before you make that determination, it's probably behooves you to make sure you're talking to your compliance folks with the FAA. You're really looking at the totality and making sure that every effort is made to try to integrate these in before you make that final determination. Some other minimum standard add-ins that you can throw in there. And again, it's not required, but this is just things that a lot of people will put in there. I'm sorry. Oh, there we go. Hours of operation. Again, you may not require this across every deal, but if you want your mechanic shop to be open, you know, Monday through Friday, 8 to 5, or have Saturday hours, or whatever the case may be that meets the needs of your airport, you can put those in there. Again, you can get into space requirements. You can, even though you're not going to get into lease terms, you can require that if someone's going to operate an FBO, they're going to have a ground lease, or they're going to have a facility lease on your property. Those are pretty common. You're not going to obviously have someone drive in a mobile truck and do all your services. Yes, you could if that's what your needs were, but more than likely you're going to want to require that if they're going to operate on your airport, they have some sort of a lease agreement with you. Again, training and qualifications of employees, customer service standards. This is something that can be kind of a touchy subject, but you can require that they wear a uniform, that they refrain from swearing and displaying vulgar messages and all of that. It should be pretty common sense, but again, I'm sure most of you, if you've done this a while, you've seen it all. And if there's a will, there's a way. So making sure, again, you're setting that bar of how your airport is serving your users and making sure that that is part of it. Environmental compliance, signage, safety things, then of course, insurance requirements. So what do minimum standards don't cover? Typically, things that are found in a lease. These are things that, again, I think most of us have seen those leases, and they're not going to cover. We need to make sure that we keep those documents separate. If you start writing your minimum standards and you start finding that you're writing a bunch of stuff that's already in a lease, get it out of there, because again, all you have to say is you're required to adhere to this lease agreement, and now whatever those requirements in that lease agreement are is what they're going to have to adhere to. Again, thinking about minimum standards should mold the type of business they run, okay? Not a condition of a lease to keep their yard mowed or something like that. It is really how they operate to make sure that it folds into the fabric of your airport. Rules and regulations. Again, these are not rules and regulations. So if you find yourself going in there requiring, driving access and self-fueling practices and what you can store in your hangars, that's not covered in that. In fact, that's the next big task at our airport, is to develop rules and regulations. We've had minimum standards in place since the 80s, at least. That was the last version that we were working with when I just updated them. But we do not really have a set list of rules and regulations. And a lot of it is because most of our airports have just kind of been on the good old boy system, right? Common sense, good old boy stuff. And unfortunately, in this day and age, it's not the same. And you can't just walk out and say, hey, knock that off, quit doing that. They want to see it in writing. They want to see it contractually. So they're going to have to give it to them. But again, those are rules and regulations stuff. And then again, non-aeronautical activities. If you find yourself talking about restaurants, rental cars, things like that, again, you can by all means set a minimum standard. And I would encourage, if that's something you have, setting those minimum standards, but it's not going to be covered by the FAA. That's going to be a non-aeronautical activity. So final thoughts. Minimum standards are timeless, but do not need updated. I can tell you, looking at I think it was a 1986 version of our minimum standards, we were still using them until we updated them. They became very clunky, and there was some things that really needed to be polished off and refined in there. But the backbone, whoever wrote those original minimum standards, which I think was Peter Van Pelt, did a really good job because they were timeless. There wasn't language that was outdated or anything. It was just, it really needed to be, again, remolded to how we currently operate. So making sure that you write them in those ways will benefit not only you, but everyone beyond you. If it grants exclusive rights, it's not all right. So again, that's a direct violation of grant assurances. And so if you find yourself basically, whether it's a direct or indirect, so thinking about things like, I'm going to implement this and only one person can adhere to this, you might be okay, but you're going to might have an uphill battle as well. So making sure that it's a standard and not something that you're using to squeeze someone else out. Minimum standards should be looked at as a positive. Okay. Yes, nobody likes to see more rules and regulations, but who can argue from a business side or a user side when we're trying to do is make sure that there's a quality service, there's fair competition, and that we provide the best service to our users available. And if you put them in those terms, who's going to argue with that? Because I'm going to tell you, I've had a couple of instances where our businesses have come to us where we've had a shade tree mechanic or we've had a independent person pop up that didn't get authorization. And you know what their complaint was? Well, I'm over here having to rent space. I'm over here having to have insurance and all that. And they're coming out here in their flatbed truck and working on a plane in a hangar. That's not fair. And they were right. And I was able to go, hey, buddy, you're out of here. Go. If you want to, you're welcome to do service here, but this is the minimum standards you're going to adhere to. Here's the application. Come back and talk to us when you're ready to do this. And then they just disappeared. And it also provided some assurance that, because we didn't know that guy from Adam, he just popped up. And so we want to make sure that those people are absolutely worthy of what the services they're providing. Bill for what you want and need, not necessarily what you have. If you don't take anything away from that, make sure that you're looking at that and looking forward. It's very hard, particularly if you've got buddies or you've got a political tie-in of people running an FBO or a group out there that is just really hell-bent on doing what they want to do. You've got to raise that bar when needed. Although not wise to copy and paste from another airport, foundational excellence found in others can give a great roadmap for developing your own. And all I mean by that is what I was talking about earlier. You're not going to copy and paste, but you can find some great formats out there, and being able to sometimes, like what I did is I found a format I liked in PDF, and obviously I didn't want to retype everything. So I reached out to that airport directly and said, listen, I know your minimum standards aren't going to apply to our airport, but I love the format. Can you give me the Word version? And they, of course, they sent it to me, and I was able to just go through and change it to what worked for us. And it saved me a whole lot of time and energy. And then don't confuse minimum standards with rules and regulations. And I think we've talked about that multiple times. Here is some reference material out there. To be quite honest, you can just go to Google and type in minimum standards. And one of the first two things that comes up is going to be this advisory circular. But there are some other things that covers a little bit in the airport compliance manual in chapter 10. And then also there's just some nice little one-off things out there. National Air Transportation Association provides a kind of a slick sheet or color pamphlet that really simplifies minimum standards, or some other like not AOPA, but some AOPA like groups that provide just little quick reference things on what minimum standards are. So those are things that I use to help develop this and not only rewrite ours, but develop this presentation. And that's basically what I have today. And I'm happy to answer any questions, although I probably don't know much more than what's on these slides. I'll be more than happy to try to dive in and answer those questions.
Yeah, thank you, Paul, for that presentation. Does anybody have any questions for Paul, either in the chat or on Zoom? And Paul, there's a request to see if you'd be willing to share the SWO minimum standards with Mike Richardson.
Absolutely, Mike. If you'll just send me an email, we'll ship it over to you.
Awesome.
And actually, Mike, if you're just wanting to look at them, we just got them on our website as well. If you go to our flystillwaterok.com website, they're on there as well, but I'm happy to email them to you as well.
Awesome. Does anyone have any other questions for the presentation today? Paul, I may throw one out here. You kind of mentioned the minimum standards. You don't want to be constantly changing them, and they may, in our case here, last for a couple decades. How often would you say an airport should be updating their minimum standards? Should we be reviewing that once a year? Should an airport just kind of wait, for a while? What would you say to that?
I'm going to say, at least we actually put it in our minimum standards that they will be reviewed annually. And again, if you have something like an advisory board or an authority, again, it's kind of a specialized group. That's a great task for them to do. Even if you just send it out on email and say, hey, just want to make sure everybody's okay with these or anything that need to be changed. It's also a good touch point with your current operators that are on your airfield to say, hey, we're just doing our annual review of minimum standards. Anybody have any things they would like to see, anything that we need to change? Again, it takes a really quick time to send out those emails and get maybe a few comments back. And most of the time, probably the hardest year I anticipate is going to be this year, because it's brand new as far as the rewrite. So as we put things out and into play and people start diving into them a little more, Obviously, there might be some typos, or there might be some formatting things we need to change to better, mold to our environment. But other than that, I would say just reviewing them annually. And then again, having that for kind of that forward thinking to look at what's ahead, particularly in the area of fuels and the type of aeronautical activities that we're starting to see, whether it's UAS stuff or whether it's, electric aircraft or whatever. You want to stay on the forefront of that. And if you don't have it in your minimum standards, at least have a plan to get them in there in a timely manner.
All right. Does anyone have any final questions before we wrap it up? All right. Well, thanks again, Paul, for that presentation. That will conclude session 9 of OCAP for today. As a reminder, for those who may have entered late, we do have our exam taking place next week. I know quite a few of you will be taking that. And if you sign up on the Jot form link that was sent from Logan and I, if you didn't get that, feel free to reach out about that. And then for those who have signed up, you should have received a Dropbox link with all of the presentation material. And then Paul will be adding this presentation to that as well for those of you, again, taking that exam. So again, if you have any questions about OCAP, feel free to reach out to me. And until then, we'll see you all next time. Thank you very much.